Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Beth Gilligan from the Coolidge Corner Theater. We're thrilled to be hosting the Signs on Screen discussion of the wonderful new documentary, Oliver Sacks, His Own Life. The film is streaming now at coolidge.org as part of our virtual cinema. I know we have a lot of our fellow art houses maybe tuned in tonight. So if you haven't seen it yet, it's a really extraordinary film. Definitely go and support your local art house. Go check it out there. And we're just grateful for the support of our audiences during this time. Every time you rent a film or buy a T-shirt, it helps our nonprofit organization. It's one of the biggest challenges we've certainly ever faced. Tonight we have a very special discussion. As I said, the film is remarkable. It's Variety called it a portrait at once tender and thrilling, a movie that presents us with a man who was that rare, if not unique thing, a scientific navigator of the soul, which I think is a very nice way of summing it up. We have a slight change to the program for anyone expecting filmmaker Rick Burns here. Unfortunately, he's a bit under the weather, but Kate Edgar is going to be here in his place. We're thrilled to have her. Many of you may recognize her from the film. She's the executive director of the Oliver Sacks Foundation, and she'll be joining the rest of the panel. Just quickly before we get started, to thank our sponsors for the Science on Screen series. They include the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which provides major support for this program. This is a series that started at the Coolidge back in 2005. With the support of Sloan, we've been able to expand it to 86 art house cinemas nationwide. So we are in Juneau, Alaska, we're in Nashville, we're in Queens, we've been in Honolulu and Austin, in Grenada, Mississippi, all over the country, bringing science and films and discussions together. So we are so grateful to them and to Doran Weber. They also supported this film, incidentally. And Ruben Anders Scientific, they've been longtime supporters of the series at the Coolidge. Our series founder is Richard Anders. Ellen Hoffman and Ken Loveday, they are Brookline residents who've supported the film. And also a shout out to the Brookline Booksmith. They have been a promotional partner for this particular event. I know during COVID, it's kind of tempting to press that yellow button for Amazon and order a book really quickly, but your indie bookstores like Booksmith are amazing places. They also really need your support. All of the people featured on this call have great books that are available at brooklinebooksmith.com. You can order them, pick them up at the store, you can go into the store, whatever your COVID comfort level is, but we're thrilled to have them. There are across the street neighbors, and we are always grateful for their support. Also to everyone at Zeitgeist Films, at Steeplechase Films, and yeah, we can now go to the event. So that moderator this evening is Dr. Sean B. Carroll. He is the executive producer of the film. He's an evolutionary biologist and architect and head of Howard Hughes Medical Institute's Tangled Bank Studios. He also has a recent book, A Series of Fortunate Events, and he shares the honor with Dr. Gawande and Oliver Sacks of receiving the Lewis Thomas Prize for writing about science. We also have, as I mentioned earlier, Kate Edgar. She's executive director of the Oliver Sacks Foundation, and we have Dr. Atul Gawande. He's a surgeon, public health expert, and writer. So without further ado, please take it away, Sean. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Beth. Welcome, Kate. Welcome, Atul. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks to the Coolidge. Fair disclosure, a long time ago, I lived in Brookline. I know Coolidge Corner well. I assume you've all tuned in because you're curious about the extraordinary life, work, and legacy of Oliver Sacks and the new documentary film, His Own Life. And we're going to talk about all these things. And I want to first start off with Kate, who had an extraordinary relationship with Oliver as his longtime editor. And every extraordinary relationship has a beginning. And so Kate, how did this start?
Well, it started with a phone call I got from a publisher that I had worked with who said, I need your help. I think you're going to like this author, but he's a little different, and he's just delivered a manuscript to me that's handwritten, and it looks like it's been dropped in the bathtub. What can you do for us? So I grabbed this manuscript, and sure enough, it was just blotchy ink in many places, lots of crossings out and arrows and things. And that was a section of Oliver's 1984 book called A Leg to Stand On. Actually, just yesterday, we published a new edition of this book. But that began our relationship, and I knew right away that I would never meet anyone else like this character. He was rather eccentric appearing, shirt tail out, and I think, as I recall, the manuscript itself was tied together with an old belt. So we just slowly started spending more and more time together, and I realized that in order to help him get books written, I had to be his organizer as well as his editor, and sort of take that kind of role as well. So that was the beginning of a long and wonderful relationship. I've spent 30 plus years at his side, more or less.
And Atul, you can confirm that that's really how the publishing business works, is that you get an editor for life, and they put your life in order, and they deal with all your scraps of paper and turn it into a book. Isn't that how that works?
Completely. That's I have to say that Kate, I've met you a couple of times before, and you're always very careful to stay in the background, and you let yourself be in this documentary. And that process of how his manuscripts came to life, you knew from his overflowing mind, the kind of scattered nature of a lot of stuff. He was overflowing with material. Your relationship reminds me of Gordon Lish and Raymond Carver, where Gordon Lish played a very important role in getting it into a crisp, getting it under control. Is that what your relationship was? It makes me, because it is not the normal editor relationship.
I mean, yes, and I'm honored to be compared to Gordon Lish, but yes, that was a lot of the job, frankly. His mind was overflowing, and yet he was a troubled man when I first met him in the mid '80s, and you can see from the film why that would be. He had a terrible childhood in many ways, wonderful in other ways, but he was really struggling with so many things, including a sense that the medical profession didn't really accept him, didn't approve of what he was doing, and all kinds of other things. But so I was almost his writing therapist in a way, trying to give him a sense of confidence and keep him on track. And he also was a kind of writer who could not edit himself. So instead, if you said, well, why don't you work on this paragraph? He'd sit down and type out another 50 pages in a different mode. And then I'd be facing, 4 or 5 different drafts that were all wonderful, but totally different. And have the task of trying to, weave them together into something. So that's a very intense and intimate process. And, it just was so fascinating. I could, at first, of course, it was part-time. And then as he got more successful and we could make it work, it became a full-time job.
And when you describe him like that, Kate, you think, that he was sort of almost, totally within himself, but he had the room to be generous. And Atul, when you've written about your encounters with Oliver, he was quite generous towards you. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I was a fanboy and not much more than that. I only met him 2 or 3 times, but we struck up a correspondence along the way. And in a lot of ways, it was really the letters that started that dialogue, and the generosity of just sending a letter about a New Yorker piece, commenting on it, and not just to pat you on the back, but to say, did you think about this? And did you think about that? And I've been thinking about this. When he wrote On the Move, I was writing Being Mortal, and we exchanged manuscripts. And, it was a remarkable thing. I feel like I got a tiny glimpse into what those who've been as close to him as Kate experienced, which was, I mean, I brought, for example, some of the letters, and you can't quite make it out here, but they come in this script where they're the cross outs and circles, and this goes down here, and I've got another idea, and I'm going to scribble it along over here, and it's just, it reflects his overflowing mind, and it pushes you and prods you in this wonderfully generous way, and he's he as far as I know, I don't think he's ever sent an email. He certainly never emailed me, and it was a very special thing to get these fountain pen written, crazily crossed out items where you could just see the thinking going on and imagining Kate getting manuscripts that look like this, wondering how that worked, right?
I have to point out that the letter you just showed was his attempt at writing neatly and clearly. So, yeah.
So this overflowing mind, which incredibly productive, but it started always from this place of observation. And I guess Oliver has talked about having migraines from an early age, and migraines were sort of his way into this observational medical writing. Can you talk a little bit about that, Kate, about his influence, about the influence of he read other works by sort of observational writers, and how that stirred up his interest in perception and consciousness and started him down this path?
Yes, he often talked about having migraines when he was a child, and the kind of migraines he had gave visual effects that were very frightening for a young child. And his mother would explain to him that was okay, that was his brain, and it would resolve after a while. But you can imagine this just brilliant kid who's very thoughtful about analyzing his own experiences of the world. And then as he grew up a little bit, he started reading a lot of 19th century writers, whether they were naturalists like Wallace or Darwin or Bates, or novelists, Dickens, Conan Doyle. He loved Sherlock Holmes. So that sense of observation was very deeply instilled with him from the beginning. And then when he got finally into medicine, he went back again to read those 19th century neurologist descriptions, which are so novelistic and detailed.
I got to add here that for me, that was such an influence, that sense of observational detail combined with a humanity and an empathy that made him a kind of person out of time. It was so clear that his resonance was with a medicine of the 19th century, where you were really spending time to deeply observe people. Everything was an experiment because there wasn't knowledge, and so you would try things and then follow from it. And he would have been so at home in that world, people experimenting on themselves, taking their own drugs. Like instead he was thrown into the late 20th century, where he was a misfit and outcast from everything around him in medicine. I thought the documentary did an extraordinary job evoking just how, not just that it happened, but how disorienting, troubling it was for him, how much it made him seem like like he was failing in his life. And he was such a private person, and then at the same time needing to be accepted in some way. And it was a miracle in many ways that the writing would make it happen, because once he came out with his work, for me, I read him first as a medical student, and it was during that time that I just was taken in. I feel like, as I've written about this before, that I learned more from Oliver Sacks about what it is to be a doctor, about what I wanted to be like as a doctor, than almost anybody that I trained with. That sense of observational detail and that sense of understanding the whole person, and not just seeing the papers and the tests, but really trying to see the experience, whatever way things turned out.
And from your colleagues, you have a sense that inspiration was not unique to you.
No, I mean, he was changing and transforming the way that, it's funny because it's sort of the hidden curriculum, the unwritten curriculum. Many of us were reading him as we went into medicine, influenced to go into it to capture that sense of it's a detective story, and it's and you're deeply invested in people's lives, and you really get to see the whole breadth of human experience, and that draws you in, and then it gets beat out of you along the way. and you keep going back to those roots of the stories he was telling, to remind yourself why you were in this in the first place.
Well, I'll confess a tiny hope of my organization and why we got involved in the film is I thought, this was this incredibly empathic physician. And I thought, what inspiration could this be to the next generation of doctors, health professionals, nurses, psychologists, et cetera, who, work with people who are often neglected and underappreciated, not seen as people, but seen, only as patients with a problem. And so hopefully that film will do for viewers what some of those early books did for you and for many of your colleagues. So Kate, you described his interest in, for example, reading the early naturalists, and he described himself as sort of an explorer, an adventurer, of the mind. So for 30 years, you traveled with him. Well, where did he travel and why?
Oh gosh, where did he not travel? I mostly, with a few exceptions, I remember, we went on a family vacation to Peru at one point, but mostly I traveled with him to do publishing business or, visit a subject he was writing about. But he loved to travel. He loved unique places, islands. The one place he never made it to was Madagascar. He was fascinated by that. But he loved going on botany trips. He visited Brazil several times to visit the jungle, the Amazon, the Pantanal. So he loved thinking of himself as an explorer, I think.
Billy Hayes has a great essay about him staying with Bjork at her house when he went to visit Iceland.
Yes.
The combination of the two of them, both aliens from another planet.
I'd love to be a fly on the wall for that one.
Well, the funny thing about that is that our office got a message from Bjork's assistant saying, she was a big fan of his work. I think it was Musicophilia had just come out. And could she come and meet him? And I said, oh boy, how am I going to explain to Oliver Sacks who Bjork is? And I said, look, you really have to meet this woman, just do it. And she came in and the two of them together were just wonderful. And they struck up quite a friendship.
I'm sure Rick Burns wished he had the camera for that time. So did he have his writer's hat on all that time? Or do you think some of those were just experiences? Guys, he loved botanical gardens. He loved nature. Was that just more the visceral and aesthetic experience for him? Or do you think that writing mind, that storytelling mind was running on these adventures?
I think his I want to call it his verbal brain was always on. And he never went anywhere without an empty journal and lots of pens. And I remember one time when he was going into the rainforest, we managed to find for him a sort of waterproof notebook that you could write on with a special pen. But he wouldn't go into these experiences necessarily intending to write about it. But he just writing was how he processed his own thoughts.
And do you have these notebooks and things?
Oh, yes. There are many hundreds of them.
Yes. There'll be many scholars will enjoy that.
Yeah.
Atul, in the film, Robert Krulwich, I think, has a remarkable description of Oliver's impact of taking patients who had been forgotten, warehoused, and of storying them back into the world. What do you think are some of the most important stories that Oliver told?
Well, I think, I'll tell you an example of one, and you have Temple Grandin in there. The ways in which he brought people who had neurotypical differences, now what we call a range of different ways your brain works. People like Temple Grandin, who have autism, but can interact and represent an enormous range of experiences and of manifesting in the world. The essay he had on Tourette's, again, who could imagine that you would have detective characters who could play Tourette's, could have Tourette's and manage to incorporate that into what made them an effective detective, because everyone underestimates them, right? And it's almost hard to pick any one of them, because every essay ended up taking something that everybody looked at as, this person's a freak. And the first time you read them, the first time I read them, I'm uncomfortable, because he's dissecting this person like they're a specimen on the table. This is the weird thing they do. This, he's not covering up any of it. He's describing what they look like and how he reacts to it and so on. But the result is you've made a whole real person, and where everybody else will look at them as a freak, he will step back and say, no, this is just this person, and look at what the brain has done and what a special thing that has created, that organ in our head has created. And then once you understand, you open your eyes enough, you can see where their worth is in the world and how they can participate. And I can't tell you the number of essays that have humanized people, like face blindness. Mm-hmm. We really wouldn't have understood face blindness and, the man who mistook his wife for a hat. But, you have now, John Hickenlooper is face blind. A governor could admit it, has to figure out how you can be a governor and a politician and then running for Senate in a world where he can't recognize anybody by face and manage to make your way through. And it is a normal thing. He is not excluded from, I can't even tell you how many ways those different essays have had an impact on the world.
So Kate, you brought this up earlier, that he, certainly when you first met him, he wasn't getting the respect from the medical community. Yet, as Atul is describing it, he's a pioneer. He's describing these cases in ways that they resonate with, the next generation of physicians. They're sort of putting some of these syndromes in a different light. So did that gnaw at him? He was, while the public was, adored his writing, and while the public waited for the next book, the medical establishment was blasé or worse. Did that gnaw at him?
Oh, certainly. He definitely wanted the respect of his colleagues. And in fact, as a younger man, he had wanted to be a bench scientist, but he was really so clumsy and terrible in the lab that they sort of said, get out, go see patients, you'll do less harm over there. And but it's also, you have to remember that The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, it was his fourth book. So, he had been laboring for quite a while to try to describe what he was seeing. And Awakenings, although it was praised in the literary world, was not very well noticed. I mean, I think in America it got one single review. So he was mainly ignored for a long time.
How did that get turned into a movie? Sorry, I'm interrupting. Keep going. I do wonder. Yeah, get to that story after you tell the story.
But he was working in these backwater hospitals that the sort of fancier doctors wouldn't dream of going to. And so they said, well, who is this guy? Where's his credentials? And I think more fundamentally than that, they said, Sachs, where's your data? We want to see numbers. It's very well to describe these people, but where's the data? So I think that was a sort of product of the times when medicine had become very statistically oriented, very chemically oriented. It was not about seeing the whole person.
Atul, did you pick up on that early, that while you were, as you said, a fan, that the establishment that you were becoming a part of was not? And did you understand that disdain? Did you understand that disconnect?
Well, what's funny is that I even now, I don't know quite how to put it together. What I love is that Oliver respects the quantification. He respects the molecular biology. I mean, it's become so incredibly important. You have to understand the science. You have to absorb all of that. None of that prevents you from seeing the big picture and relating to the patients. And there's always felt like this disconnect in your medical education as a nurse, as a in my case, a surgeon, in whatever part of medicine you are. There are the mentors you have who are brilliant at helping you understand the depths and the complexity of the science and all the drugs and the things you have to memorize and all that kind of stuff, and have incredible insights into that world. And then there are the people who understand what can get belittled as the touchy-feely stuff, and really deeply be fantastic doctors to patients and really observe and help you understand that. And as medical students, we admired both. We loved having both. It's rare that those people can be the same person. And part of what I love about medicine is it's full of all different kinds of people. And the establishment hadn't incorporated it. And yet, as Oliver, went through his career, there was a period after The Man Who Mistook His Wife for Hat where he was becoming famous and a certain resentment took over. But by the time a decade after that I'm going in, he had fans throughout the medical profession. I mean, An Anthropologist on Mars had come out, which went even deeper and farther. And you started realizing what that influence was already beginning to be seen. I went to Harvard and there was no disdain for Oliver Sacks by the time 10 years after Man Mistook His Wife for a Hat.
And
really
so would you
was.
say, is it built as a body of work? The weight of the body started to take over and have that impact.
That's right. It shifted the way people wrote and talked and how you made contributions. I mean, I remember also around that time an influence for me was Abraham Verghese, who is a wonderful medical writer and who was also influenced by Oliver to, he was writing about AIDS, and to connect the science of AIDS and the experience of really seeing patients closely in rural Tennessee who, where there was an HIV outbreak and violated all the social norms that, we don't have gay people in Tennessee, and we certainly don't have this disease here. And in fact, they had a substantial outbreak in the little town where he was working. And I remember, seeing that influence side by side. Oliver was like an icon on a pedestal, and it made me think about what kind of doctor I want to be, but I couldn't imagine being the writer. And then Abraham, who's the next generation, Abe, reading him made me think, well, maybe I could do this. And when that time came, and I think it was, it has become a whole generation of people doing lots of inspection of medicine itself.
We all need role models. But these pioneers are extraordinary because they didn't necessarily have I guess his role models were all in the 19th century, and you didn't have a chance to meet them. Yeah. Let's pivot for a second, because a couple things came up in both of your last comments. So here was this incredible observer with an amazing insight into individuals. For me, the revelation of the film is that although he had been in analysis for 50 years, did he really want to turn that light on himself? I mean, he was obviously engaged in his own analysis, but he didn't necessarily share that with the public. And so both his autobiography, Kate, On the Move, and even this film, which is even bolder, of course, because he's in such a vulnerable state. How big a shift was that from your vantage point, Oliver looking at himself? How big of a shift or of a transformation was that to open himself up?
That's a great question, and I can only guess at a lot of things, but I think a lot of it does have to do with moving through life and getting to a certain age. When he was around 65 or so, he started working on Uncle Tungsten, which was the memoir about his childhood. And I think, that's a stage when some of us are thinking, well, gee, we don't have that much time left. What does our life mean? What do we want to say to people? And I think everyone has a desire to be known by others in some fashion. And Oliver, I think, found that a good experience writing that book. It made him consider and perhaps understand his own beginnings a little better. So by the time he was almost 80, this started, as all of his books seem to start, with just a series of little pieces he would write. And Billy and I, Billy was his partner, would certainly, kept encouraging him and saying, well, write about this, or your motorcycles, or your weightlifting, and trying to kind of coax him to put these things on paper, in the thought that they might be a book, they might not be a book, but just write it, because who else can do that?
I have to wonder, though, I mean, Uncle Tungsten was a very contained story.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the surprise to me about the documentary is how, ribald he is, how talking about sex and his own experiences, right? And I didn't know, is that new? And did that, or was that the way he always was, and he just was careful in how he wrote about himself publicly? Or did he come out of a shell in some way in being able to talk more openly about his homosexuality and his experiences?
Yeah. He was always like that with a very few people. As even from the mid 80s when I met him, I pretty soon had all the all the life story and then some. But I think that you're right. It was very late before he felt he could really be public, especially about his sexuality. He was worried, and rightly so, that in the culture that he lived in, this would be frowned upon. I mean, this is a guy whose most beloved work is working for an order of nuns called the Little Sisters of the Poor, and he thought, well, what are they going to think? So he was afraid, and when Billy came into his life, it took a little while for him to be comfortable with really being publicly with Billy among friends. But this was one of the reasons why I had some years before that moved him to an apartment in Greenwich Village, because it's normal there. So yeah, I think it was a process slow process of being comfortable with that, which had depended on the culture itself changing.
He comes across in the film, as he's up for some great self-deprecating humor. And if no one wants to hear this next line, just don't listen. But Atul has one of the best lines in the film when you describe Oliver as a supreme fuck up. And you're referring especially to his early days as a resident and all that. But, he's also exposing that this person whom people hold in such high regard, that he had such a turbulent ride, experience coming over here and rising through the ranks of medicine, and some of it self-inflicted. That's a lot to share with an audience. So, as you said, he was a certain way with only a very few number of people. Now he's a certain way with a global audience.
That's right.
So how do you reconcile that? First Kate, but then we've got to let Atul elaborate on that great line.
Well, I'll just say that when he got the diagnosis in January of 2015, and he had literally just delivered the manuscript for On the Move to the publishers, and it was due to be published in September. My first call was to his editor to say, look, we have to publish this before September. He won't be alive by then. And we all so wanted him to be alive, because this book was his coming out. I mean, it's got this incredible, sexy picture on the front, and people were shocked, but very embracing. I mean, no one was like, "Oh, that's terrible." And I needed Oliver. He needed Oliver to himself to feel that, and then by April, when the book is published, all of a sudden he's a sort of gay icon. And it was really just such a sort of fairy tale ending in a way that finally he could be accepted for what he was.
And the book and the movie and the device that Rick Burns, the director, uses is having Oliver tell a lot of his story in the movie. But Atul, what you were referring to really was his early days, this very self-destructive, intensely driven time period, and perhaps more than that. But he was doing nothing, this is not how you would coach a resident to make it in the ranks. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, I think the movie brings it out, incredibly well. Like, imagine him working for you, and you're the chief resident on his service, and he might or might not be coming in, and will have spent the weekend driving 36 hours on his bike just to see the Grand Canyon, straight through the night and then coming back in whatever shape he might be in for that. I think the amazing thing is that he was his own case study. That the people he was writing about, he was one of them more than he was one of the medical establishment. And the people he was not writing about were the people he was working with every day and around him. As far as his colleagues go, he was really writing about the patients whom the colleagues weren't identifying with at all. Imagine you're there with the Little Sisters of the Poor. You are living with these deeply locked in people, working for years with them, and really identifying with them in many ways more. And I think that reflected his sense that he had something of worth to offer. He was different like them, and showing they had worth was helping him establish they had worth. Some of that is, I'm imagining, and I don't know if Kate would validate, but I felt like On the Move, just reading it, the voice that was coming through was a freed voice, where he could turn the camera on himself. Uncle Tungsten was about his life, but it was not about him in the same way. And this was about all the tough stuff, the ways that his mother had thought he was an abomination, the way that he was trying to navigate this and ultimately had 30-some years of celibacy, about all the jobs he couldn't manage, about his drug history, about his weird weightlifting years, as setting the California record for, like all of those amazing things. But On the Move, in a way, felt like he made himself a full-fledged citizen of the world. He storied himself into the rest of the world. And then by the time he came upon his fatal diagnosis, he really had this series of 4 remarkable, viral, widely read New York Times essays about his own mortality that wouldn't have been possible, I don't think, if he hadn't made that journey. I don't know whether you think that's true, Kate.
Well, I have to say, I think he was deeply influenced by your book, Being Mortal, and took a lot of solace from that in a way. But yeah, I frankly, in some ways, that last year surprised me because, for a man who had been at such extremes for most of his life in all sorts of ways, extreme weightlifting, extreme, he would either eat enormous quantities of food or nothing at all. And it was like that. And we all sort of thought like, oh my God, what's going to happen when he faces this mortal diagnosis? And in fact, something really remarkable happened. It was as if his neuroses just fell away, because he could see really clearly he had a limited time. He had things he wanted to write, not only those incredible 4 pieces or 3 pieces in the Times, but a New Yorker essay he'd been working on, a lot of different pieces that he published that year, because he just, as you say, his brain was bubbling over, and he worked.
And he didn't lose any of the energy in the neuroses. Well,
Right.
several of our viewers have sent in some questions. I just want to share some of them. I'm going to move around a little bit between some topics, but I wanted to address this to both of you. So one viewer writes that Dr. Sachs has been a hero for many years. His relationships with empathy for his patients moves me deeply. I wonder if he ever spoke of being overwhelmed by these relationships.
Kate, you should take that one. Yeah.
What what a great question. Because I don't know that he was overwhelmed in the way that I would be, for instance. I'm the kind of person who's just can't sleep if my friends are having difficulties but I think he had the doctor persona, which I think is sort of a shield when it needs to be. But I never felt him express that. I think he just wanted to focus on how he could help that person, often by just listening to them. And then if he was writing about that person, to try to explain the situation both for himself and for a larger audience.
So Atul, let me rephrase that just a slight bit and pitch it back to you, which is the empathy. Is too much empathy a bit dangerous for a physician?
He had a particular brand of empathy that I find really interesting and freeing, and it's sort of not dissimilar to the state you try to experience in meditation, which is to simply observe and notice a person, notice what's going through, apply no desire, no want, no preference to what should happen to this person. And that was empathy, to simply see them as they are and not wish for anything more, not wish for them to get better, with no judgment, just see it. And in that sense, when you ask the question, I don't know him as well as Kate, but what she said validated my sense of him, which is that he was not overwhelmed by those experiences. In some way, it can seem really cruel that he was not overwhelmed that the man who mistook his wife for a hat, he was diagnosing a fatal condition that his face blindness was caused by what he diagnosed as a tumor that there was no treatment for, and he would die. And he applied no judgment to that. He didn't tell you, oh, I'm so sad about it or anything like that. It was what it was. And that on one level can seem really cool or even cold. But I really think the empathy came across from the fact that he applied no judgment. He really, even to the idea that you may die.
I think that's such a beautiful way of putting it. It's really magnificent, because ultimately it's about dignity and about giving that person their own agency and their own individuality.
Another viewer writes, asking about whether any of Dr. Sachs' patients were individuals on the autism spectrum, and as the movie makes clear, the most famous being Temple Grandin. And they ask about the experiences he had with them, and maybe you can talk about the experiences he had with Temple in particular. What's most striking is something that Temple says, which is emotionally, Oliver got her. And that surprised her, that he had that insight, an emotional insight into what made her tick. Either one of you want to react to that?
I have to let Kate, because I can't comment on how he interacted with her or others.
Well, I should just clarify that Temple was not a patient as such. In some cases, Oliver would write about people who he learned about, like Temple, because he was interested in exploring this idea of autism. And he did treat some younger people with autism at one point. So he was certainly familiar with the condition. But yeah, I'm sorry, I'm losing the thread of it.
Yeah, I guess the remarkable thing, because we were talking about this empathy and insight, that in fact his impact on thinking about was his experience in the articles he wrote, at least the article I know about that he wrote on Temple. What influence did that have of perception of people of the autism spectrum? And again, his insight that, at least she remarks in the film, he got me. No one had ever gotten me before. And I was so struck by Temple's reaction, or her narrative of that.
it's hard to remember at this point in history when everybody's talking about neurodiversity. In 1993, when he published that article, he had just finished an article about an autistic savant artist, Stephen Wiltshire. And almost as a footnote, a friend called up and said, you should really talk to Temple Grandin because not all people with autism are really deeply disabled. She's a professor, a PhD, she's a lecturer and so forth. So he hopped on a plane and met with Temple Grandin to just find out what is this. And he was intrigued. And I think, they both were intrigued by each other. But so he's really just bringing the reader along on a ride where he's learning all about Asperger's syndrome, which at the time was virtually unknown.
Yeah. So in this body of work, you're still mining it because there are some recently published things. Some things have been published after Oliver's death. And there were lots of topics that interested him, and one in particular about creativity and the creativity of writers. And he talks about this in River of Consciousness. And since we have, a longtime editor and a brilliant writer on here, Oliver had his ideas. I guess he was also thinking about where his ideas came from and how those ideas needed to incubate and could come out maybe, many years later. And so he had sort of his theories of, I guess I would say, of creativity. And I just wanted to, Kate, you must have seen that because you must have seen vestiges of things that wouldn't show up again for years, maybe a topic, a strand of thought that would then show up later. And you just see that mind of Oliver's churning, and he didn't necessarily take, a certain tributary at a given time, but many years later he did. Can you just kind of paint a picture of that?
Well, there was a very striking example, and I think Atul might recognize this one, but at the very end of his life, the last few months of his life, he was trying to write an essay about eyes in different animals throughout the animal kingdom. And we had discovered in his archive an incredible document from when he was 15 years old. He and a couple of his buddies had formed a biology field club, and he was the secretary of this club, and he had written some notes up about his own lecture that day, which was about eyes in cuttlefish. So you see, that this lifelong fascination with cuttlefish and squid and invertebrates and even just eyes had pursued him his entire life. Really?
I wish he lived long enough to see a film that just came out called My Octopus Teacher.
Oh, I'm dying to see that because I know he would absolutely adore it.
I'm just going to say it's a plug for a Netflix film, but it's a remarkable story, and I bet Oliver would have been just absolutely gripped by it.
Yeah.
So let's pivot a little bit. There's some questions from viewers. We have to deal with also the very heavy subject that is foreground in the film and for Oliver, which is death and how to face it. And obviously, Atul, you've written on this deeply. It's said in the film that he gave a master class. Atul, now looking at the film and the essays that Oliver wrote, and what sticks with you? What do you think is really important to share with other people?
I think a couple of things. We were in dialogue through this period. He looked at my manuscript for Being Mortal, and we corresponded about that, and then his own experience of dying. He faced complications, and he would write about that. And in his letters, he would deal more with the emotions of it than I would have expected. He was despondent at times, and he felt sometimes, as he put it in one letter, the negativity is taking over. And then he would, in the letter, work his way through and remind himself about what the purpose he has still is. And he found a lot in writing about it, and in writing about the experience. And I think that there were two aspects. Number one is part of what Being Mortal, the centerpiece of what Being Mortal was about, was the discovery that there is, everybody has goals in their life. Those goals, they have goals besides just living longer. What those goals and priorities are in your life change over time and are different from person to person. The only way to know what they are is to ask somebody what their goals are and ask them to articulate them. And our job in medicine should be to help apply the skills and capabilities of medicine to those priorities for your quality of life as well as your quantity of life. And I think he saw in that an interest in the variation in people themselves and in his own experience of what mattered to him, and trying to return again and again to not the hopeless parts of it, but to what creates worth. In that time that he had, writing still was central to him, but he also began to talk about, he talked about, let me see if I can find the quote here. Well, I won't be able to easily find it in one of these letters, but he really saw as time was, oh, here it is. He said, he was beginning to think in even apocalyptic terms, but I'm held back, he said, by the thought that of people who will continue after him. Good scientists, good physicians who give me hope for the future, a hope one needs very much when one's own life is close to the end and the negativities of life seem to darken the horizon. And that was a letter, the last letter I got from him was 4 weeks before his death, and he could see it coming. And I think that he brought that out in those essays he wrote in the New Yorker. And that's part of why they also went around, because he was able to reduce them to simply observing his feelings, his torture, his sadness, but also the things that he could be grateful for. And that lingering sense of gratitude, which became the title of the book that collected those essays. I think that he was able to bring that same judgment-free empathy to his own experience. That was a remarkable thing.
Mm.
I find it interesting. It's in your 2015 piece that you wrote, this exchange you had with him, that he mentioned he gets hope from scientists and physicians. And I thought, well, thanks for that. I'm not getting a lot of that love these days, but Kate, are you at all struck that he specifically mentioned scientists, physicians? He didn't mention, artists and musicians and things like that. He I guess that was just core to him. Is that?
He adored music, but his heart really was with scientists and physicians. He loved nothing more than to, curl up with a good biography of a scientist, and he must have read hundreds of those. So, yeah.
That's it's nice that he was a fan in turn. In a few minutes we have, I want to make sure to take some questions from folks who've spent the hour with us, and we're going to back up a little bit because there's a couple questions about awakenings, and I'll put the two questions together, which is, first of all, just a brief synopsis of the story of Awakenings, and then how did the film, after it was released, how did this change his view of himself, not his world fame, but his own view of himself?
And while you're at it, throw in how it even got, as you said, the book was barely reviewed. How did it get noticed and turned into a Robin Williams film?
Oh, so okay. I wasn't sure if we were talking about the book or the film. Yeah, he was approached in the late 80s by two nice students from Yale who had their professor, I think it was an anthropology class, had said, "You've got to read this book," and it was Awakenings. And at the time, very few people had read that, and they said, "Well, we'd like to make a movie." And I think it was their first movie project, perhaps. One of this was Walter Parks and Larry Lasker. Walter has now run for many years the DreamWorks studio, and he's a very eminent filmmaker, but that was what they decided to tackle first. So it took some time, as these projects do, to get a director attached, which ended up being Penny Marshall, and she brought in Robin Williams and Robert De Niro, who met with Oliver, met many of his patients. There were a few still living from the Awakenings era then, did a lot of research, and started making this film. Oliver was actually on the set frequently as a sort of medical advisor to make sure they didn't, commit any great sins like taking the pulse the wrong way or something like that. And I think, for a Hollywood movie, which is never quite the same as the true story, for instance, it condenses the time frame into like one night when all the patients sort of awaken at the same time. It's very true to a lot of the story. There is a sort of fictional romance between the doctor and the nurse and so forth. But the remarkable thing to me was that it was when that movie was released that a lot of the medical community who had been saying, well, this guy's just a grandstanding, sensationalizing writer, all of a sudden his colleagues started saying, oh, can we offer you a fellowship for the American Academy of Neurology or whatever? So that was a turning point.
It was a turning point. So he felt it. He felt more acceptance. He felt more recognition. He felt okay. So that put the wind behind his back from that point on.
I think in large part. I mean, of course, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for Her Hat, which had been published in 1985, that was really the beginning of the shift.
Yeah. So any more movies in the works that you can talk about?
Oh gosh, I think we have a very wonderful movie right now. No,
put you on the spot.
Books maybe, but movies probably not.
Atul, I think I'm just what message do you think Oliver has now? I mean, he was mindful of his legacy, the way he wrote. I mean, you talk about how writing was important to him, but of course, what he was expressing was deep and articulate thoughts about the meaning of life, the meaning of his own life. To both laymen and the medical world alike, what do you think is the message that his writing in this film has for people in these times as well?
Yeah, one of the things I've wondered about is what would he be like in this particular era we're in, at the time of coronavirus, at the time of Trump. He was very non-political. He never seemed to get engaged at all in the political controversies of the day. But I think he had a political commitment to the idea that the individual mattered. And he was taking that to a depth of belief and dignity that I think he would have found this period we're in utterly shameful. And that we have been in a position where we've contemplated that, well, if some old people die, we need to get back to football stadiums, right? And that you would be regressing by having leaders making fun of the disabled, or it so ran counter to the core value that he was bringing out that I think is represented in medicine, but not lived in the same way that he was challenging everybody in medicine to live. And in a sense, he was challenging the whole culture to take seriously the idea that every life matters, every life is of equal worth. It's a basic constitutional idea that we are all created equal and that we live lives of worth. And he was pushing that to a deep extent that, I don't think he saw as political, but it was a larger idea that that created life around a core value in medical ethics, and I think in how democracies should work.
I think that's a perfect note to close this discussion on. I know I'd like to talk to you guys all night, but I want to thank Kate, I want to thank Atul, and I want to turn it back over to Beth for some closing remarks. And I want to thank all the viewers for tuning in and for their questions and for their attention and for your embrace of this film, which I think has a lot to offer a vast and diverse audience. Beth, do you have anything you want to share before we exit tonight?
Just to say thank you all for joining us. And if you have friends who want to see the film, again, it's playing on the Coolidge virtual screening room at coolidge.org at an art house near you. Please check it out, spread the word. This discussion also will be available after the fact. So it's a fabulous discussion. So please also spread